Hello and welcome to R&R's Ask the Expert. I'm Kayla McGowan, editor-in-chief, and today we're diving into a pretty hot topic, which is contents restoration and cleaning. But we do have a little bit of surprise for you. We might dive into the commercial side just a little bit deeper than we normally do in this space. My special guest is Jeff Milligan, and he is the Vice President of Sales and Strategy for Prism Specialties. Prism Specialties specializes in the restoration of electronics, textiles, and art. Jeff initially joined Prism Specialties as a franchisee, and he played a key role in growing the business and developing a roadmap for future franchisees. He built a profitable legacy as a franchisee, and well, that's where he sits now, right? Obviously, it led to a path of success. After selling his interest in his own company to his partners, he transitioned to corporate leadership role. He continued to drive strategic success as a corporate leader, and he's here with me today to dive into all things content. Everybody, welcome Jeff.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the intro.
You are so welcome. It's nice to meet you and dive into all things content. I think
Yeah.
content is always like such a hot topic, but I think I kind of gave some great background about you, but how did you get into our industry, if you don't mind just kind of giving that brief little spiel?
Yeah. So I had a job change back in 2012 and started looking around for different franchise opportunities. And at the time, we were called ERS back then. And they had just started selling franchises and it seemed like a good fit, good in, recession resistant type of business and just good opportunities to kind of get in on the ground floor. So I was excited to get in and did it for almost 10 years. And like I said, sold my interest to my business partner and came onto the franchisor side.
Yeah, and it's really cool to hear how everybody kind of comes into this industry and it just grows on you. You grow to love it. And I
Yeah.
think that's very similar with contents, right? It's very specific, but I also think that there's a world of residential and there's a world of commercial like you and I briefly talked
Sure.
about before hopping on to this podcast. So, with that being said, can you share something, maybe an experience about a project you had that was rewarding, right? Where your contents cleaning practices made such a difference and an impact, which I know it's on all projects, but is there
Right.
one that specifically stuck out to you?
Yeah, it's interesting because on the residential and commercial side, they're different needs, but the results and then are ultimately the same. So on the residential side, you have a family that's been impacted by a fire, and you think of a family that has, college or high school age kids that they have sports and they've got all the school activities and all that. So how can you get that family, back to normal as quickly as you can, knowing that they're going to into temporary housing? And so, but they need things like their backpacks cleaned for school, right? Their computers, their sports uniforms, if they're doing club sports, all of that as well. In addition to the things that they like to have, like game systems and things like that. So trying to take something that's been really devastating and bring some, normalcy to life after it, like that's where really that people are most appreciative because the process is long and confusing and complex. But if you can just bring some normalcy to their everyday routine, that's where people are, really appreciative. So it's rewarding when you get that, that part of it. On the commercial side, it's same but different, right? You have a lot of these businesses with business interruption, but in the manufacturing side that we do a lot of work in, you have just-in-time contracts. So these businesses cannot miss a delivery or they're going to lose a multi-million dollar contract. So how can you get equipment that is the priority back in service so they can meet those deliveries and not risk jeopardizing those contracts? So really working hand in hand with the adjusters and consultants and the insured on those, is a big deal. Not just from saving money on the BI part of it, but also just keeping that business afloat long term.
Yeah, and I would just say, highlighting both the commercial and residential side, I know we oftentimes in our space talk a lot about residential because that's who we serve, right? A majority of us serve residential. However, the business side is actually really big as well, right? Because we're also businesses. So, natural disasters don't just skip us because we're in the business, right? And I think we have to remember that as consumers and those we serve in residential areas, they also rely on the commercial side of things too. So we have a due diligence of helping in both spaces. And sometimes people maybe don't go into the commercial space because they don't know everything that they need to know. And so I think it's great that you're diving into this so it helps clarify,
Yeah. Hmm.
maybe some key differences, but also key similarities, right? I think that that's also really key to remember that there are a lot of similarities. And so just keep that in mind when you maybe are exploring something new, such as going into the commercial side of things, right?
Yeah, and that's part of it is, you're triaging every loss you go on. So instead of looking at a large commercial loss as one giant loss, you look at it as parts because you're not going to do it all at once. So you have to figure out, what's step one, what's step two, what's step three, and it just translates into, okay, this is one large project, but it's really like think of it as 30 houses, right? Instead of one giant project. And then some of that overwhelming feeling kind of goes away because now you can really triage and then set the scope accordingly.
Yeah, and then I would say once you've done a couple, starts to become second nature and you get a little bit more comfortable. But, at Interconnect, I know we briefly talked about this, that
Yeah.
their theme was basically pushing yourself beyond what you think your limitations are. And I think this also is fitting, right, in the commercial side of things, or somebody who's going from commercial to residential, push yourself to those limits and help your community in different ways, or partner with somebody that is even maybe a competitor to learn how to do that because let's face it, natural disasters are a big part of our industry and as well as, singular instances, but it would always be nice to be able to rely on one another and help each other grow. So speaking of all of this, I know we talked about the differences, the materials that are in the homes and the things that we touch, but what are some essential best practices that you guys all follow over there at Prism to ensure successful restoration of everybody's belongings?
Yeah, on the residential side, it's having a sense of urgency and getting out there quickly to determine, how bad the loss is, how acidic is the soot, what type of mitigation things you need to do right away. Are things wet? So whether you're talking about art or electronics or textiles, now, things are sitting for too long, then they can get moldy. So what can you do immediately to triage some things, get out there, get things packed out, get them into a drying room to start that drying process and mitigate further damage. Um, commercials the same way too, honestly. If you think about residential, like the most common fire is a kitchen fire. We do, you know, tons and tons of restaurant fires on the commercial side every year across the country. And it's the same thing as like getting out there, trying to treat any flash rusting that's happening so you're not getting additional rusting effects. And then just again, trying to figure out what are the priorities to preserve equipment so the damage doesn't get worse, but then also to get that business back up and running as quickly as possible. And if you're making that transition from residential to commercial, I mean, you're working in a kitchen in a house, you're working in a kitchen in a restaurant. Obviously, the equipment is different, but it's still a stove, it's still a refrigerator. It's the same type of things on a little bit of a different scale. But you can kind of scale up and scale down with labor resources as you need to, but it's just kind of transitioning what you already know in the residential space. A wall is a wall, right? So how do you clean that wall? How do you clean the electronics? How do you clean all those textiles of the art? It's the same methodologies, scales a little bit different, but if you kind of have that mindset, it makes it easy to make that transition from the residential work to the commercial work.
Yeah, and I would definitely say, like you said, there's similarities and there's some scale differences, right? And I think if you approach it with that type of mentality, it'll allow you to maybe understand, even if you don't want to dabble in that work, at least you can understand and know who to call in your area. I think that's the other thing too. I know you guys handle some pretty big jobs. I think I talked to Adam not that long ago about a water job, right? And so that is a commercial size job, but you're still handling all of these items with care. The goal is the same to restore and clean these items to pre-loss condition as best as possible and hopefully save as much as you can, right? I know that there's there's some instances where not everything can be saved, and that's really hard too, right? And it's no different from commercial or residential, right? I think that's the other thing is understanding the similarities, but also understanding the differences can help people in the long run, especially our industry, right? I think you shared an interesting stat. The number one thing is kitchen fires, which I think is common sense, but is it? You never know depending on, what you do as your main source of service in this industry. And kitchens, I'm not surprised in the restaurant, arena that is one of the number one thing. I mean, that's the number one thing. That's not a surprise at all, right? You've got tons of people in the kitchen, too many cooks in the kitchen, if you will, and sometimes things do happen. So speaking of all of this, I know that there are some challenges in restoring some items, whether they're delicate, sentimental, or just, historic. Maybe there's just something that's been in their family for quite some time, or even the business, right? I think there's a lot of family-owned businesses that have things passed down from generation to generation. So when you're handling those materials, how do you maintain like the handling and the quality of care with those specific items?
Yeah, it obviously on the residential side, some of it depends upon how damaged it is and how you take care of that, how big it is. You have to build a crate to move, a giant piece of artwork out of a house or a sculpture or a chandelier. Um, how old it is, how fragile is the frame if it's a framed piece of art. So, having, trained art technicians that are trained in not only removing something from a house and how you handle it and how you pack it, like you don't bubble wrap something, right? Because the bubbles will leave marks on the item. So, just things like that. And then getting back to our, to our facilities, a facility where it's climate controlled and you have the right humidity levels, especially like in southern states with high humidity and being able to, especially like, oils on canvas are very, susceptible to humidity. And and just kind of knowing the right process, but kind of taking it a step further and taking a little bit different approach than what you're asking is residential is pretty straightforward most of the time, right? Unless you are in a cat event. So whether, something's covered by flood insurance, or in this case, like all that, we're doing lots of work in California around the wildfires and who has wildfire coverage and who doesn't is a whole, different aspect of it. But in the commercial arena, one of the challenges is underinsurance, believe it or not, where you have some of these businesses that have been open for so long and they've purchased equipment a long time ago, but their insurance coverage hasn't kept up with the replacement cost of the equipment. So in that case, restoration is the only option because they can't afford to replace that equipment because they don't have enough coverage to replace it. So you see that at all scale levels, from just, your mom and pop, Italian restaurant down to, large manufacturing facilities. Just that there's kind of coverage issues that you don't see necessarily on the residential side on, an everyday loss.
Well, I think like to your point about underinsured or things like that and claims, really, it's an issue on commercial side. I think a lot of people talk about residential because they handle residential, like a majority of our industry handles residential. But I think it's interesting to hear that that's no different, right? And I think at the end of the day, they're all consumers and that will always play a role. I think that's one key
Definitely.
thing that I think is huge to really like stress. Like if you are dealing with, like you said, the wildfires, right? You're not just dealing with residences, you're dealing with businesses, you're dealing with total losses, essentially. And then there's, who has wildfire coverage, who actually has the right coverage, right? Because
Right.
a lot of times people are underinsured because of costs and things like that. So, I think that's really important for people listening to just take a second and take that in because I think that's really key in our industry. And maybe there is an opportunity to talk about that. Like, what have you found helps you navigate in the commercial space that maybe help in the residential and vice versa? And this is where this type of conversation really
There,
helps.
yeah, and there's definitely something, the way we approach it is that, you know, people love their artwork, right? They don't really care about they may care about some of their furniture, but they care less about the other stuff in the house. Our work is kind of the easy one in our space, honestly. But that's not how insurance works, right? Insurance, most policies are written that if you can, restore or repair something and get it back to pre-loss condition, that's how a policy is written. The disconnect, though, between the insured or the customer and the process is, and we hear this all the time, is that customers feel like they've lost control of the process and they didn't have a say in what happened. And so the way we approach our process is that it's their money and we're here to help them, but they should be the ones deciding what they want restored and not restored, and then working out a cash out with their adjuster so that things aren't being forced on them because they're part of the process and the decision process. The whole process goes better and more smoothly. The customer is happy and they get the things returned that they want, and then they get money for the things that they don't really care that much about. And it actually creates this really good balance, and creates a really good kind of customer service environment. So we've used that kind of across our network nationally, and it really has paid dividends in terms of like our customer service scores and all that. And I think that's good just for the industry is the more you can empower your customers to be part of the process, the more seamless the whole process goes, because by the end of it everyone's frustrated. I mean, these with building supply delays and costs and all that, I mean, these having to rebuild a house or repair a house takes months and months and months, and people don't want to be out of their houses that long, but it just is the process. So more things that you can do that put them and give them kind of more control of the process, the happier everyone is. And we've seen that time and time again, especially with a lot of the contractors we work with that have that same mentality. Those jobs go a lot smoother than other jobs.
And I would definitely say just to that, I think there's a lot less headaches along the way because there's a lot less back and forth is from what I'm understanding from what you're saying. And honestly, you took the words right out of my mouth. Just not just customer service, but the seamlessness, right? It just makes it so much easier on all the parties. And let's face it here, we're all busy. We all have work to do, just as our customers do, just as the carriers do. And they have just as many jobs, if not more, than we have. And so to make it a seamless and communicative process just makes such a difference. And I'm sure you're actually able to speed things up just a little bit. Even if it's only a couple of days, it sure does make a difference. So I think that's really key. And educating your customers along the way, I think also prepares them for future instances, whether it's for themselves or a family member or a friend. They can confidently say, hey, I went through this. Yes, it's scary. Yes, it's not fair, but here's what worked for me. And then ultimately, you could also have a referral come out of that, right? So I think there's some great things that can come out of that.
Well, and plus, Google reviews are such a big deal. And so such a big deal in our industry. And, having those good reviews just is a good validator for the next person that, has a loss and is just going online and checking your reputation and they can see that. I mean, that just helps your business tremendously.
Yeah, and I think this kind of leads me into my last question because I think this is so big for our industry and all industries surrounding ours is, advice from fellow industry professionals on how, you can balance our techniques with client care and contents. And I think we kind of touched on it, but is there anything we may have missed? Because I know we're always trying to keep up with technology and the latest and greatest, but how do we balance all of that, but still take the best care of our customers that is possible?
One of the biggest things I've noticed I've been now 13 years in the business, is that when I first started, everyone was siloed. No one worked together, no one talked, everyone was ultra competitive with each other. That has definitely changed. And you see a lot more, regional contractor groups that they're all competitors getting together, but they're sharing best practices or they're sharing risk management topics and things like that. And there's a lot more collaboration. And I thought some of that has to do with the consolidation in the industry as well. But that's actually really good to see, is that people are learning from each other and applying those best practices and growing. And that leads into better customer service and better customer care and managing through adjust or push back and TPA concerns and all that. So that I think really has had a ripple effect through the industry. That collaboration has really been beneficial and hope to see it kind of even grow tighter. I live in North Carolina and there's a couple contractor groups that get together, and I think everyone really benefits from it.
Yeah, I would definitely say, just to add to your point, like, yes, we are quote unquote competition, but actually we collaborate too. And for all of us to succeed, we need to lean on one another. And I think that's great, no matter where you are in the United States or even other countries, because we know that our industry reaches far beyond the United
Yeah.
States. It's nice to connect and hear what works and doesn't work, or who's tested the latest and greatest and things like that, because I think it allows us to elevate, but also problem solve or help one another and make sure that all of our customers across the world are taken care of the best they can be taken care of. So I think, thank you for
Absolutely.
sharing that, because we all are in this together, no matter what company we work for or where we're located. I think that's the other big thing. And, you know, the best advice comes from your peers. So thank you for your time today, Jeff. Is there
Thank you.
anything that you wanted to share that we maybe didn't touch?
No, I think this has been great. I mean, obviously everyone's running around crazy right now because it's trade show season, um but no, it's I appreciate you invited me on and enjoy the topic and love talking about the topic, especially commercial. So thank you.
You're very welcome. And as always, everybody, we will see you on the next episode of Ask the Expert. I can't talk. Excuse me. Take care.